Ja, herzlich willkommen zurück bei uns und jetzt kann ich Ihnen die Keynote ankündigen. Geraldine van Bueren ist mit uns. Ich würde Ihnen ganz gern unsere Keynote-Sprecherin kurz vorstellen. I'm very happy now to welcome Professor Geraldine van Bueren, the lawyer who wants more academics to come out as working class, as The Guardian wrote in June 2019. Professor van Bueren held the chair of International Human Rights Law at Queen Mary University of London and is visiting fellow at Kellogg College, Oxford. And just a few remarks on her career, just to introduce it. She's one of the original drafters of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Child and also helped draft the United Nations rules for the protection of juveniles deprived of their liberty. And she was for the UNHCR, or what a difficult acronym for me, guidelines on refugee children. And she was working on the United Nations Program of Action on Children in the criminal justice system. And in 2003, Geraldine van Bueren was awarded the Child Rights Lawyer Award. Geraldine, you did many other things, but I stop now just to give the public an impression of your wide range of activities. And you are currently writing a monograph, Class and Law. And as The Guardian wrote in 2019, she is a Cockney, without or with accent. I don't know, I cannot estimate that. And I just cite again the Guardian article from 2019. During her academic career, Geraldine didn't talk about her working class background for a long time, until one day a student came to see her and told her that she was torn between her academic ambition and her mostly working class community, friends and family. That was the moment. Perhaps we can talk about this moment later, Geraldine. That was the moment for you to pick up this topic. And Geraldine van Bueren is the founder of the Association of Working Class Academics in UK. You can, after her keynote, you can write questions in German or in English, no problem. Sie können Fragen auf Deutsch und Englisch in den Chat schreiben und Geraldine freut sich auf viele Fragen und die Diskussion. And now I will hand over to Geraldine van Bueren, who will give us a talk with the title Taking Class Seriously at a European and Global Level. Dear Geraldine, welcome. I'm very happy that you are here. The virtual stage is yours.
Vielen Dank, Isabell. Ich wünsche, wir könnten heute Morgen alle zusammen sein. Es wäre schön, Sie persönlich kennenzulernen. Es wird uns allen leichter fallen, wenn ich Englisch spreche. Aber ich werde langsam sprechen. As Isabell said, I used to keep my working class origins private, and a student came to see me. As Isabell said, she was torn between this desire to be a lawyer and the opposition from her family and community. And without thinking, I said, I know what you're going through. She leapt out of her chair and angrily, and this shows how desperate she was, she angrily told me I could not possibly know how she felt. I told her that my father had worked in factories, and then when the factories closed, he was unemployed and later became a taxi driver. After that, I had knocks on my office door from other working class students, all with similar concerns. It saddened me greatly that decades later, after I went through all those obstacles in my path, nothing had significantly changed. So very nervously in 2011, that's 10 years ago, I wrote an article for a national British newspaper, The Independent. The title of my article was Why We Need More Working Class Professors. Normally, when you write an article, as you know or may know for the press, people write in saying they agree or they disagree. But here there was complete silence. But when I opened my emails, there were many emails, all titled private, confidential. The emails welcomed my article and shared their own stories of obstacles and roadblocks placed in their way because they were working class. The same is true in America. In the United States, an academic colleague wrote that he found it harder to come out as working class than he did to come out as gay. which shows you the severity and the depths, not only of his resilience, but also of the prejudice around. So I thought it was a good idea to set up an association of working class academics. But when I approached other senior academics, they did not want their social origins known. I respected their decision. Later, when younger colleagues wrote about experiences, which I thought very brave, I approached them and we established the first association of working class academics, and we're now international. We support students and academics and regularly hold seminars supporting postgraduate students in their studies, as well as a series of other seminars where members can share their experiences privately, amongst us, and supportively. We're now international, from the United States to Australia. We're drafting a university code for universities all over the world to be able to support and make more universities welcome for those of us from working class heritages. And we'd be delighted to share that with you. And if you'd like to join us, our website address is www.workingclassacademics.com. Working Class Academics is all one word. And I've given our email address to Leah and to Isabell. Because, as strange as it seems, class discrimination is legal, not only in the United Kingdom, but in many other countries of the world. It's not only in universities that such discrimination exists. So that when a student told me she'd been shortlisted for an interview, and at the interview was told there was too much of a social gap between her and her fellow solicitors, the lawyers, those lawyers were acting lawfully. They could not have said that in relation to religion, to race, or sex. Similarly, in a comment on a recent study of those born in 2000, the London Millennium Study, it found that a higher percentage of middle-class students shoplifted in comparison to working class students. The researcher said she found the results puzzling and, quote, "You would think it would be the other way around. It is unlikely she was aware of her unconscious bias. Why should it have been the other way around?" So what is it about that student's background, my background, other working class backgrounds, or I prefer the word heritage because in English that denotes a positive, which are fundamental to our identities and sense of self, but that our class makes us invisible to law? And I want to make it clear at the very beginning that by class, I mean richly diverse, intersectional concept of class. Class embraces race, religion, gender, as well as all the protected characteristics under international treaties and national laws. My argument is that although there's space in national law and regional and international law to read in class, and so prevent and protect against class discrimination, this has not occurred and is unlikely to occur for a long time. Therefore, I'm arguing that now is the time for us to include an express prohibition against class discrimination in national, regional, and international law, and that relying upon the existing protection has proven grossly inadequate, even contributing, as I shall show, to the unnecessary early deaths of some people. I'm not arguing that only working class discrimination should be prohibited, but all forms of class discrimination are unacceptable for democratic societies based on dignity. And as we know, the German Constitution is based upon the principle of dignity, which is found in Article 1. The right to dignity has been described as the right to have rights, and is clearly broad enough to include the dignity of classes with less access to resources. So in order to make a case to prohibit class discrimination, we need to consider, is class still important? It's generally unrecognized that class even impacts on human rights institutions. For example, the Council of Europe, which has established a European court to judge and pass binding judgments on civil and political rights, the rights to freedom of expression, privacy, religion. But it's only established a committee under the European Social Charter to pass recommendations for socio-economic rights, such as the right to adequate housing and the right to food and an adequate standard of living. Socio-economic rights clearly benefit everyone, but they have a particular importance for people with less resources. States have to ratify the entire European Convention on Human Rights, but they are legally bound to be only bound by a part of the European Social Charter. And this attitude towards rights affecting the poorest in our community also feeds down to national levels. There is a significant and unacceptable difference in life expectancy in my country, in the United Kingdom, between different classes, even in similar areas, neighbouring areas in the same city. The World Health Organization conducted a study of Glasgow in Scotland, and it was reported, and also in relation to a London authority, and it was reported there was a 10-year difference in life expectancy based purely on wealth between neighbouring communities which actually bordered each other side by side. This is a clear case of inequality affecting the right to life, but the class aspects of the right to life are very difficult to argue in courts. I've argued elsewhere that in the avoidable tragedy of the fire in Grenfell Tower, class was also a dominant theme. Race, asylum, disability and age also played significant roles. But in the Royal Borough of Kensington, Bourdieu's idea of culture, economic and social capital played out clearly. Residents were perceived of having little economic, social, cultural and economic capital. And so their justifiable concerns about fire safety were ignored in such a way that I think violates the European Convention on Human Rights. So class is still important. It affects the most fundamental of human rights, the right to life. This is why class is expressly mentioned in the Indian constitution. Its preamble, the opening words, set out the spirit and enshrines equality of status and opportunity. Class has numerous mentions in the constitution. Class is mentioned in a language which to English ears is undesirable, as it refers to backward classes and socially and educationally backward classes, albeit to improve life conditions and underrepresentation. But the Indian Supreme Court, in cases such as Indra Sawhney, recognised that caste is often a form of social class, linking it to occupation and poverty. It also considered that those of us who've already benefited from such protections should not do so over and over again. And India's example shows how class is capable of being described beyond the traditional Western working and middle classes, and is capable of being identified by different countries according to the relevance of different classes. Some democratic governments in the West also think class continues to be important. Canada, for example, has a minister in its government for middle-class prosperity. I don't know who looks after the prosperity of other classes, but it still demonstrates that in some form, class still matters. In South Africa, an organisation brought a major case concerning a lack of policing in a township in Cape Town and stated that its evidence, it was working class and poor. And in the United Kingdom, the Runnymede Trust, which represents and campaigns for racial equality, said, we should recognise that the working class has been left behind and held back. And these issues affect all working class people, including black and minority ethnic communities, who are also working class groups. Class resounds through numerous social immobility studies, evidence in the UK that those from poorer backgrounds performing the same jobs with equivalent and equal qualifications are receiving lower salaries. But class is largely invisible to legal remedy. It is as if the law has donned blinkers. So, is the prevention of class discrimination appropriate for a legal remedy, or ought it to be left exclusively to politicians? The Victorians thought that class discrimination was appropriate for law. The Housing of the Working Class Act 1890 was designed to improve housing conditions. But historically, law in Europe, including in the Roman period, Asia, and in colonial America, has focused on class, but in an exclusionary way. So that in England, we had laws telling people during the medieval period in the 14th century who could wear what specific styles of clothing, what material, and who could eat specific foods. So law is capable of dealing with class issues, but there's a significant difference. Traditionally, laws were intended to reinforce rather than remove class barriers, excluding those from poorer backgrounds. I'm arguing that the situation should be reversed. There's also been a morality linkage to different classes, with those of us from poorer backgrounds scoring lower on the morality scale. So that in the United Kingdom in the 19th century, there were two major, quite progressive studies of poverty. But what has been overlooked is that those who lived in the streets were color-coded, and the streets were color-coded according to the moral standing of their inhabitants. It's as if being born poor or wealthy were aspects of an individual's character. But I think this has changed with COVID. Industrialized societies, including the UK and Germany, have become dependent on frontline workers, many of whom are working class. And this has resulted in a long overdue re-evaluation of working class people. And I think this creates a historical opportunity to re-examine our laws on equality and human rights and ask whether it offends our sense of fairness that class discrimination remains lawful. What does it say about our values attributed to law and its role in society? Surprisingly, for over half a century, there's been space for courts to read into existing laws a prohibition on class discrimination. The European Convention on Human Rights in Article 14 has a right not to be discriminated against. And the grounds are social origin, property, birth, or other status. And this is repeated time and time again in other treaties, very similar prohibitions and national laws. And it's possible to read into social origins, birth and other status, and class discrimination. In fact, I would argue that its non-exhaustive nature, together with the context of property, social origin, and birth, positively invites us into interpretation, but this has generally not happened. And indeed, Germany has a broader protection than the European Convention on Human Rights because of the enshrinement of the right to dignity, which could be used to strengthen a prohibition on class discrimination. There have been some powerful dissenting judgments, including in Garib and the Netherlands, where there's a recognition that Garib belonged to the sociologically underprivileged and that the applicant's poverty constituted a threat to the ordre public. But although the late American Supreme Court judge, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, eloquently observed, dissenting judgments are speaking to future generations, I think the issue of class discrimination, because of its impacts on life and life chances, is too urgent to wait for future generations. A more promising approach is that of Cyprus, which does expressly prohibit class discrimination in its constitution. And at a global level, there's been a recognition of a specific class in the 2018 UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. And Article 2.3 importantly recognizes the existing power imbalances between peasants and those who make decisions that affect their lives. These legal provisions show awareness not only of poverty, but also of class in terms of the way in which class relations work in entrenching poverty and violating human rights. But this recognition of a power imbalance when class discrimination is not prohibited has not generally been developed by the courts. Mainly because such notions of prohibiting class discrimination are entangled with revolution and dictatorship. So the Chinese constitution talks about under people's democratic dictatorship led by the working class. So we may leap to the conclusion that all attempts to prohibit class discrimination have been prompted by communist and former communist states. But Cyprus is not communist. And during the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, much of the efforts to include an express prohibition of class discrimination, which failed, came from Latin America. And the United Kingdom was one of many countries that said it did not object to its inclusion. And the United Kingdom is not known as a revolutionary communist state. Now, there are definitional challenges in prohibiting class discrimination, but those definitional challenges echo all the way through human rights. It took 10 years for us to reach a definition on who is a class globally under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I hasten to add we were dealing with other matters as well. And definition is often raised by those who wish to retain the status quo. Much has been written about the difficulties and challenges of defining disability for the Disability Convention. But in none of these cases did definitional challenges prevent the adoption and widely ratified treaty coming into being. Sometimes even definitions in national laws are left broad and in treaty law. For example, discrimination is prohibited on the basis of religion and belief, and trust is placed on the implementing bodies and the courts to set the boundaries of that belief. And the boundaries are very wide. It's ranged from those who do not believe in a God to those who are opposed to the eating of meat. So if national and regional courts are able to arrive at judgments on belief, then preventing discrimination based on the class discrimination will not present a greater challenge. It's also argued unlike other prohibited grounds of discrimination, there's too much fluidity in defining class. People sometimes feel they've moved from one class to another, but the right to change religion is recognized in all laws. And similarly, there's also a fluidity in definitions of gender. And as the writer Bell Hook has argued, there's no necessity to abandon all working class cultural values to move into spheres traditionally the domain of other classes. So as with religion and belief and gender, it can be explored on a case-by-case basis. And this allows space to discuss class, which as well as economic, is also social and cultural. The long overdue acknowledgement of racial equality, and more recently Black Lives Matter, has shown how much we can learn from histories and stories which have been devalued and therefore ignored by many. So if we were to make class discrimination illegal, other equally valuable and overlapping stories can be told. Instead of class, there's been a focus by governments in Europe on social exclusion, on socioeconomic status, and on poverty. And social exclusion has been very valuable in tackling poverty, but it hasn't really made a perceivable dent in addressing issues of social mobility. And you need to have both structural social exclusion and a prohibition of class discrimination. And although terms may change from country to country, as with blue collar in the United States, I think there's an added value in acknowledging that class is an important facet of people's identity. Another added value is that it will prohibit a change in culture so that insulting terms would no longer be acceptable. And such a change in language could lead to a change in political and media perceptions and depictions of class. Class fairness would not be competing with the other prohibited grounds of discrimination. It would do the opposite. It would reinforce those prohibitions on discrimination. We do not live our lives with only one facet to our identity. An intersection of identities, which includes an express prohibition of class discrimination, would reflect the value that law would place on the dignity of all of our lives. Finally, for those who argue, as many do, when change is suggested that now is not the time, we should remember the words of the civil rights activist. If the times aren't right, change the times. Class clearly has a major impact on lives, from life expectancy through to careers, and therefore class discrimination needs to be prohibited. It is in the public and national interest. Vielen Dank. Ich freue mich auf Ihre Fragen.
Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you very much for your speech and for these many details and ideas. And there are some questions in the chat. Just one remark from my side. I have the feeling that we are shy to talk about class. You know, you have these milieus, diversity, and you talked about heritage, but to pronounce the word class in Germany, I think it's not modern in the moment. We are a little bit shy to use it. It's my impression, and I don't know why. We just can discuss that. But let us start with these questions in the chat. The first one is this: what you spoke a little bit. I wonder how to define class. It doesn't seem easy to me. One user said so. Because also the classes have changed. They are not as defined as before. So the definition of class, how do you react, or how do you define it? You said it's a social factor, it's a financial sector. Just can you give us some points?
I think it's true. It is difficult, and definition has always been difficult. If you look at religions, you know, what is the difference between a religion and a cult? I think it will differ from country to country. In Latin America, you have this concept of and I think it will probably happen in Europe post-COVID, of the precariat, those who are in danger of changing, but changing down rather than up. So I think we have to leave it to country and consult widely on definitions. I don't think one person should prescribe. But I also think it's wrong to say that the working class and the middle class have completely disappeared, or the upper class, because certainly in the English media, we see who deny, many newspapers will say class is no longer an issue, but they use the word working class, they use the word middle class, and they talk about the nobility. So I think there have been changes, but I think it's changing again. And I think there's a recognition that class is relevant, and that the old divisions, working, middle, are still relevant, but there are other classes.
We talk in Germany often about Schicht, you know, we say Mittelschicht oder Oberschicht. But we have no nobility, as you have, of course. Perhaps it's hidden in Germany. So the second question is, do you believe that tackling discrimination based on class heritage is possible without a critique on the system capitalism? So the link between discrimination, class discrimination, and our capitalistic system.
It's a very good question as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are shy, that to deal with class discrimination is anti-capitalist. It can be, or it doesn't have to be, like many things. There's a whole branch of human rights called socioeconomic rights, so rights to adequate housing, food, highest attainable standard of health, particularly relevant at the moment as well. And they're dealing with the distribution issues. And interestingly, the majority of the world's countries have signed on to that treaty. And you could argue that's anti-capitalist, if you wish, but the capitalist societies have joined onto it. So I don't think it has to be. I think you could still get rid of class discrimination without bringing down capitalism.
And just also to quieten the anxious people who think when we are talking about classes, we are always try to destroy. This is also a political argument from many parties who said, okay, when we are talking about class, we are in a left-wing system, and they bring up all these stereotypes about class and capitalism. And in the German, we have, we have now the preparation to our elections in September, and all these topics are very important now in the political discussion.
Yeah, can I just say, I mean, for people who say class has disappeared, it's actually reappeared in the German elections, in the British elections as well. So it hasn't appeared, but there isn't the law to deal with the discrimination.
Yeah. We have another question, interesting question. What about positive discrimination? Do you advocate positive discrimination, or are discrimination and positive discrimination entwined, so to say? So because also we talk about in the diversity context, very often we talk about positive discrimination. How do you see these two topics?
I think that's also very important. I'm doing research on that at the moment, both with different approaches in terms of targets, in terms of quotas and so forth. For the moment, what I would say, and I'm researching this more, and I've just got a grant to help me do that, that if a country does that in relation to other forms of discrimination, then you would have to ask, why not class discrimination? What is different about it? But I want to be looking at, and I'd be interested to hear what people think actually, as to whether they think it would be effective in relation to class discrimination. But I think it would be difficult to argue that it should only happen in relation to class discrimination and not race or sex, for example.
There's another remark. Thank you for your answer, especially because it connects German discussions to international and UK discussions. How do we achieve to connect the various discussions on class discrimination, classism in different countries more systematically to make a political impact?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we set up the Association of Working Class Academics to look at that and to try and unify that. And please, do be in contact with me. I'd be delighted to take that further. Because traditionally, particularly in relation to those with less resources, they've had less resources to promote and discuss and to unify. And what has happened with COVID, in fact, is that we're all online. And so those with less resources, but with sufficient to have a computer and use the electricity, are able to connect with each other. And I think that creates opportunities. Look at this, this conference. It enables you to have people from around the world, around the country, when it would have been too expensive for some, I suspect, to have traveled.
Yeah. And you talked about the frontline workers and of the momentum of COVID. In every country, I think we have the discussion of the COVID as a momentum for change. But now we just see how the people take over her usual life. And that is a question from my side. Do you think this COVID momentum will really bring out changes? How do you see the opportunities for that now in the moment?
Well, I think it's up to us to push for it, and it will be up to us to continue to push for it. Hopefully we will be post-pandemic rather than endemic. But we're not going to be there, certainly globally, for some time yet. And I think what it's done is it's changed people's images. And I don't think that will, I mean, I understand what you mean about going back to our normal life, but I still think that image of, lazy working class, etc., not contributing to the nation, I think that change is now irreversible.
Okay.
Actually. Yeah. Even though you may still get class discrimination, but it'll be in a slightly different way, I think.
Okay, and just to come back also, the question that comes back to the question of positive discrimination again. Do you fear that positive discrimination of class contributes to a manifestation of class and discrimination on the other hand? That means if we do positive discrimination, if we define this image of class, could that also have a negative aspect of discrimination on the other hand?
That, if you look back at discussions on sex discrimination, you'll have women who are against equality because of that reason. We would be described as strong, as masculine, quote. There will always be people who argue that. But, and I think it's a very good question, but I think what it will do is allow us to define ourselves. And there are characteristics which are undervalued, resilience being one. I'm not saying they're exclusive to working class. The ability to move from one culture and to appreciate other cultures, because that's what you've been doing. And I mean, it needs to be class rather than social mobility, because some people are very happy in their own class and don't necessarily want to be socially mobile and appreciate the traditional working class values. But those working class values are not negative. You know, they're about community and sharing. And I think this kind of discussion opens up a chance to reevaluate and promote those values.
Yes, it's because in the discussion before your keynote, we have also had the remark that as working class academics, we don't have the aim to over adapt to all these other values, because when we are in the university system, we think sometimes we have to be like the others, I say.
Yes.
And we have to get rid of all our class values, as you said. And that was also the question for me. Is that my world as worthy as the other academic world? And this is a danger, I think, for working class people who go into another class or in another milieu or into another world, as we said. That is very difficult to hold on these values.
I agree, and that's why and I'll send you a copy. I would love to have your comments and anybody else who would comment on it, because I'm drafting it. We've almost finished, but I'm drafting it at the moment, so please feed in. And we talk about the value of working class experiences, histories, and approaches, and that needs to be supported and taught. And certainly, I can't speak about Germany, but we concentrate, for example, on political philosophy in England and in law on a man called John Locke. And Locke was a slave trader. He might have written about against slavery, but he actually traded it. But we don't talk about Tom Paine, who was poor from a working class background, wrote a bestseller calling The Rights of Man in the 18th century. You know, went on to participate in the French Revolution and the American Revolution, quite an extraordinary guy. But he costed all these rights out that you find, many of them in the Universal Declaration, in the German Constitution, and in our Human Rights Act. There are many working class people who have contributed, but who've been forgotten.
Yeah, we have to do that. We come later on. We have to create also histories, idols, and so on. You're right. We have another question referring also again to the system. How do we counteract the narrative of everyone can achieve anything if they just put it in the work? So how can we counteract that this history that if one works enough, hard enough, he will get or she will make a career, and that can justify the existing system? How can we counteract this argument?
Well, I think we just look at the figures. if we look at, certainly in the UK, the number of judges who come from working class backgrounds, number of prime ministers who come from working class backgrounds, at one time we even had a cabinet, a national cabinet made up, and I'm not making a party political, it occurs throughout the parties, made up mainly from one school, a private school. So I think we look at those figures, look at the data, talk about it. And this is what I meant when I said this moral linkage, because if you say anybody can achieve, then it tends to lower the moral, if you like, personality that's depicted of those of us who come from poorer backgrounds. And nobody would argue that now in relation to race, in relation to sex, or possibly, hopefully, religious belief, and gender reassignment. So what is it that's different about class? If we believe all people are equal, then that has to be shown as a myth, and we can show it by just looking at the data.
Yeah, that is the scientific approach, that the data, but the data are very often not as interpreted in the same manner, I think. We have another question.
If I come back on that, that may be in Germany, but in the UK, actually, there is a recognition.
Okay.
And including by the political party at the moment is on the right. And it is emphasizing that it's not, nor are any of the political parties calling for class discrimination.
Yeah.
So, it can be seen if you can, show that the majority of voters or a significant numbers come from a political class. There are ways of dealing with that.
Yeah, I think also in the political discourse, it is mentioned in Germany. I have the impression, but we can talk about that later, in the academic sphere, it's often ignored in some areas of university. But just the next question, you were talking about the re-emergence of class as a topic. Do you think that in the Western political discourse, people are aware of new forms of precarious work, working class jobs, like worker of the what does that mean? GIG economy? I don't know that.
The gig, yeah,
The
like
gig economy, who became literally invisible.
Yes, the computer economy, Uber, that kind of.
Ah, okay, I didn't know that, sorry.
No, that's fine. I wish my German was as good as your English, and indeed as good as all the questions English.
Do you think people are aware of these new forms?
I think so now with COVID. People have realized, and again, I'm just going to talk about England now because I've only seen the reports. People have been concerned about the level of pay in some delivery companies and so forth. And there have been cases, one actually, about being treated as, and this extends beyond England, Uber drivers being extended as really being employed with all the benefits rather than self-employed. And there is a concern as well, we've seen that more globally actually in relation to Amazon. Yeah. So that has risen, the conditions of work and so forth. So I think that's rising as the gig economy expands.
But that means also that everybody changes his daily life, and that is the next step. No, don't perhaps if you look for a book, don't make a research on Amazon, don't go to your local shop and so on. We have some campaigns here in Germany, but it's also for some special milieus. I am not sure if really it will be broader in the society to change the daily life. That is not very common, and nobody wants to change, really. I have the impression so that requested a change in your life.
It's not going to be instant, and look at climate change. It took years, and then all of a sudden it just took off.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. I'm coming back with one question to the universities, because today we are also talking very often about universities. And you described a little bit the beginning of working class academics, your association. And how do your colleagues react at university when you're now visible with this subject and your discussions, you're making speeches? How is the reaction of your academic colleagues? How do they deal with that?
Well, I've been surprised after the Guardian article. I was actually giving a speech the next day, presenting a paper, and everybody was really welcoming. I was stunned, actually. Mm-hmm. So at that level, and I'm talking about the sort of human rights community, yes. Yeah. There are others. I mean, the fact that very senior academics still don't want to join. Yeah. Or and I don't mind if they don't join, but they don't want to be identified as working class, so they feel it's vulnerable, because working classes and those with less resources are seen as doing physical jobs, and the intellectual is somehow beyond us. Yeah. And so I think that's why that American colleague wrote as he did. And so this is going to take time, which is why we have this code that we're developing and which we'll be presenting.
Do you think they feel still ashamed to be academic with working class background or heritage, as you said? Is there a feeling of being ashamed or something like that?
No, but you feel stereotypes. So somebody who didn't want to join told me that there's an expression in England about having a chip, a piece of wood on your shoulder that weighs you down, that you're that's you see your life through that, and you're angry and that kind of. So and there's been words that have been used. I went to a school it's a state school called a comprehensive, and the word used is bog standard. A bog is an insult in that sense. So there still is that, but unless we start to try and achieve change, we're not going to get it. It's not going to just come out of the air. So some of us just have to, step up. And I'm really proud of my younger colleagues, because they have had more to risk, and they've been and we've got an expansion of working class studies. There's a new journal that's going to be launched called Class and Culture, an academic journal, and so these changes are coming clearly.
Yeah. There are also two questions again about universities. What do you think universities should do to get over class discrimination in their system? What can you, as you mentioned, discrimination starts from the beginning of life of every person, but what can universities do, or what should they do?
It'd be very good if universities could gather data.
Yeah.
And benchmarks on progress of those from working class backgrounds who are academics, as well as with students. It's sometimes compiled with students. It's very rare with academics. That's a bit difficult. You see, if the law changes, then the university is bound to change. Otherwise, it has to be on a voluntary basis. And those who don't want to identify for the reasons that we've discussed won't necessarily come forward.
Yeah.
So it is difficult, which is why we need a signal, and a change in law is from the very top, that this is an equally valued status for human beings.
And the law can give the frame for all that, as you said. And there's another remark in the chat. I was just wondering, in Germany, we don't have study fees. We don't pay too much to go to university compared to UK or to other countries. Does that make a big difference for you? Is it easier to receive an academic education if you don't have this barrier? So we have no tuition fees here.
Under the UN Treaty on the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that Germany and the UK are party to and legally bound by, it does talk about making universities tertiary education progressively, quote, free. When I went to university, it was free. It would have made a huge difference, to carry that debt. My legal training, I got a grant from the local authority, but I still incurred debt, which took a long time to clear. It does make a difference. Now, there are people who argue that since we've raised fees, we've actually got more working class students, which is true because there's a system of grants. What it hasn't considered is that there's a high dropout rate from poorer students than from others. So I think the goal actually is for universities to be in according with the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And, and I've written before that I think it's illegal for the UK to charge fees at that level.
Yeah. We have, as Ann-Kristin is doing at the University of Cologne, we have, at a few universities, we have special mentoring programs. She is responsible for this program, a first generation PhD, and they offer a mentoring program for these people. Do we know that these programs like this exist also in UK? Do you know some universities who are doing this?
We don't know, and I'd be very interested to learn more from Ann-Kristin. What we've done within the Association of Academic, Working Class Academics is we've run, Carol Binns has been doing this with Charlie Davis, we've run special support sessions to do that for postgraduate students, including doctoral students.
Okay.
And one of the things we talk about in the code is, support for research and so forth, because it's, often impossible. Plus the barrier of time limits, because if somebody is working part of the time in a supermarket and part of the time on their doctorate thesis, that adds, additional challenges that need to be recognized.
Yeah, of course, with this academic career, which is not like this, straight as the other people could do.
Yes.
Geraldine, with a look on the time, I will just hand over to Ann-Kristin now for one or two questions, because I have to hop in the next Zoom meeting for our next discussion. It's just for me now to thank you, and I'm sure that we keep in contact perhaps for a conference in live with the And also we can, it's just for you, you can give us this email address where the people on the conference can contact you, or the Working Class Academics Association. We will post it in the chat.
Thank you. I've sent an email earlier this morning to Leah and to you.
Okay, Leah will put it in the chat. So please stay tuned. I will go in the next Zoom session. I say thank you, Geraldine. Later on we discuss. Thank you for the first intervention on this conference. It's the first conference in Germany at this level, so we were very proud that you are with us, and see you later. Thank you.
Yeah, also from me, thank you very much. I have also a question, because we talked to our guest this morning about the tip they would give to young working class students and academics. And I want to ask you, what advice would you give to this group?
I would be proud of your origins, firstly, and proud of everything that you have achieved because you've overcome those obstacles, and proud and value your skills, your resilience. You're clearly intelligent because you've overcome that. I would say when it seems to be hopeless, just keep going. I remember when I was younger, I said to my mother, I don't mind being knocked down, but couldn't they wait for me to stand up before they knock me down again? And so you do feel at times totally exhausted. And it's scary because you may be, as well as trying to complete your studies, you're worrying, you know, waking at 2, 3 in the morning, you know, how can you pay the rent, you know, what can you afford and what can't you afford in terms of food, which is draining of energy. And I think you need to recognize that's not a personal failing, but is because of your socioeconomic standards. And I would say, you know, what you're doing is fantastic, Ann-Kristin, and I'd like to know more, and I hope we can be in touch with that, because we'd certainly like to learn from that, and perhaps we could arrange something, if possible, with your students and our members. But that kind of support is absolutely essential from the group, and I know how highly valued it. So I'm sure we're doing the same thing as you, actually, but it would be very good to bring the students together, get feedback on what else. And again, sorry, that's not a mobile phone, a landline, so I can't turn it off, but it will turn off in a second. I'm sure that if they may like to feed into our university's code, which also looks at support in terms of research, grants, time, as well as knowledge, and a recognition that, you know, studies of working class people are just as valuable as a study on, you know, Bismarck or Metternich or Disraeli.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this informal knowledge is very important for the group. And yeah, thank you for your speech. Thank you for your time, for being here, for answering our questions.